How you doing? This is Professor Harvey. Just wanted to go through. I'm going to make this one a relatively short video and just go through the week 4 discussion questions and try to answer some of these and give some info on those and not cover any class topics this time around. So, getting right into the week 4 discussions. The first one was about permanent file deletion. And the question was, if you were an attacker, would you choose to or not to permanently delete files from a drive, right? So talking about the difficulty of potentially of reliably deleting a file and the nature of drives. Is it worth the time and effort? So here's what I would say about that. We don't often see attackers we do see attackers delete files, for sure. But seeing attackers use tools to try to wipe a file as opposed to simply deleting a file is relatively rare. This is in network intrusion type cases, which is primarily the type of thing we're talking about in this case, in this class. Now, when you're dealing with insiders or some sort of focused intrusion on just one host, or somebody who having broken into that host, or some kind of insider threat where it's someone's personal laptop, or not personal necessarily, but their work laptop. The machine you're looking at is the one that was assigned to a person, right, who's doing some kind of no good activity on the inside, embezzling funds, whatever. You do see people do that kind of thing because you're talking about an individual person who's going to be under suspicion directly because of what might have happened on their laptop, and so then trying to cover their tracks and avoid criminal liability is more likely. And while the readings this week, a lot of them focused on the difficulties of how drives work and the fact that there are often traces of files left behind on disk. And that's very true, and that can be true. It's true that even when trying to reliably or fully delete a single file, even then, there can be traces left on a disk. And we even talked about the difficulty of wiping a disk, that theoretically, there can still be things, especially when you're dealing with solid state drive. So, yeah, there can be artifacts left behind. That's definitely true. But the reality is, when someone's taken steps to delete a file, if you've taken steps to wipe a file, it's hard to get, the difference between theoretically it's possible to recover it and realistically it's possible to recover it are two very different things. The reality is that once files are if you wipe them with some kind of overwriting type or other type of permanent file deletion software, there's a bunch of them out there, freeware included, and it's hard to reconstruct the majority of it. You might be able to get bits and pieces of it. We often can see traces of it in a lot of places on disk. But it still could be worthwhile as a criminal to do that. We rarely see network intruders do that because they're usually running from command line. They're running across lots of different hosts, and they're not usually so much concerned with covering their tracks in terms of detecting who they are or where they're coming from, so much as making it more difficult to recover without or to sort of track down all of what they've done or what they may have accessed. And that usually can be done simply by deleting things. And more often what we'll also see is anti-forensic activity like stopping logging, modifying logs. On Unix systems, you see this a lot because the unfortunate thing with Unix is that the logs are generally just text files. And it can be possible, if you have root access, to simply modify the log files after the fact, and it makes it very difficult to figure out what went on there. So it could be worth it as an attacker to do this, but it's not something we see happening very often. So imaging disks. So the question here is about the advantages and disadvantages of forensic imaging for hard drives and SSDs. There was a lot of good discussion about the reading on the SSDs. And there's a lot of other good readings out there in the world on solid state drives. And yeah, solid state drives definitely have changed the game a lot. They're very common on laptops these days. In fact, maybe, arguably even the majority of laptops being sold these days have solid state drives. And it's interesting that the way solid state drives work is they are essentially emulating a traditional magnetic media hard drive. It's kind of because that's what operating systems expect. But the way solid state drives work is that they then have their own layer below that that governs where they actually store data. So they may have multiple copies of things in different places. And if you're using conventional software at the operating system level, it's only looking at that first layer of essentially like virtualized magnetic media hard drive that the SSD presents to the operating system, and it's not looking at the next layer down that the controller board of the SSD itself controls. So imaging those drives can be very difficult, because what you're looking for in an image, or what you're looking at in an image, again, is usually that sort of first layer of what gets presented to the OS, not what's really stored below. And what's really stored below is organized in ways that are sometimes proprietary from one manufacturer to another, and would be very difficult to reconstruct. I mean, there are tools out there that will let you interface with a specific drive and just dump the raw data out, and you can search through that. So that's an option, but imaging is definitely, when you're dealing with things like getting at deleted files and that sort of thing, recovering data that may have been deleted, there's a whole nother layer of that to do with an SSD. The question here is there ever a point in time it's more advantageous to just work on the original media? Almost never. I mean, I've never seen it get to the point where someone said, we're just going to work on the original media, like literally grab the hard drive of the original thing and work on it. Again, it might seem like a reasonable thing to do in a case where you're dealing with an individual machine that was directly compromised, like someone sitting at that machine and working on it for an extended period of time. But the kind of things that are the focus of this class, and the kind of things that are focus of my practice, are network intrusions. And in those kind of cases, usually you're dealing with compromise of lots of different hosts, and putting that kind of focus on a single machine, especially a workstation, we just don't see usually doing that. Honestly, the reality is we seldom put our hands physically on the media at all anyway. Usually we're having our clients image a host and then send the entire image to us over SFTP. Or worst case scenario, if they're not able to get an image, they might mail us something that gets mailed to our lab, and our forensic lab people handle the imaging, and I never touch the media, right? So the media, I never put my hands on physical media from a case almost ever at all anymore. It's very rare. Once in a while, I mean, once in a matter of years, we might go on site and have to help someone image a drive on site because they're not able to send it to us and they're not able to image it. And someone will go on site and help with imaging. I mean, from our whole team, I'd say we do that 3 or 4 times a year, maybe less. Almost never. The reality is that we work from images, and a lot of times we're working from that kind of volatile data and other types of collected data that we've talked about in the past. So this issue with imaging disks is an interesting one. These are interesting questions. They rarely come up in practice these days. So it's kind of hard to say what the state of the art is, because the whole thing of imaging disks is becoming less and less a focus of forensics, because we're dealing, again, the majority of things we're dealing with are intrusions, where you're dealing with an adversary that's gotten on a network, and they've either infected or they've compromised dozens of machines, and they're just running from one machine to the other, compromising more credentials, grabbing data from multiple different machines, and the imaging of individual machines and the analysis of individual machine images is not the end all and be all anymore. We're working from triage data a lot more often because that lets us look at dozens of machines across the whole enterprise. The last one was about running a captured disk image. Once a drive image has been captured, is there any way to bring it back to life as a live system? There absolutely is when you're talking about, usually this is done 9 times out of 10, as the question indicates, is as a virtual machine or as actual hardware. Usually this is done through virtualization. When you have an image, it is possible to mount that image usually we would mount it as a read-only volume so we can go through it rather than using a EnCase or some other kind of forensic software. You just mount it and actually go through it live in the operating system. We usually mount it read-only when we do that. And of course, it's just an image anyway, so you can always revert back to the original if you have a copy of it. So you can do that, and you can actually also, you can boot the machine once you have that machine, that image in a state that allows you to mount it, then theoretically you can bring it back up as a virtual machine. The issues there sometimes are the settings, and because virtual machines have the virtual machine disk file. In fact, most of the images we get these days that we get in my practice are from servers. And big network compromises, servers are often the focus, and the servers these days in most places, most of them are virtualized. So when we need to get an image, usually companies just send us the VMDK file. VMDK file is the virtual hard drive on a virtualized server, or a workstation. So we deal with clients who have virtualized desktops as well. So those VMDK files are essentially a virtual hard drive in the form of a disk, and they just send us that. And EnCase and other forensic software will read that VMDK file as if it were a disk. And so a VMDK file essentially serves as a forensic image. But of course, obviously, since it is the same file that the original virtualization platform was using as a disk, you can boot from that disk. The problem is you also need to know what the settings were. There's different settings you can use for the amount of RAM you have, for the amount of processors you have, for the types of processors you have, the types of there's different types of virtual network cards and so on. So the drivers that are present on that disk may not match what you're presenting as the hardware. So it's almost like if you've ever taken a physical drive out of one computer and put in a completely different computer and tried to boot up from it, you get all kinds of driver incompatibility issues and things like that. And the same thing can happen in trying to bring a virtual machine up if you don't know what the virtualization settings were for that. Would there be any advantage in doing this type of forensics work? Yeah, there can be. So sometimes it can be useful to look at malware analysis or to do malware analysis and other types of things. If you're looking at malware that's in some kind of has some kind of persistence established, sometimes you can look at that on that live system in ways that might be harder to do from a dead box, we call it dead box forensics perspective, looking at just the disk image. So there can be advantages to doing that. There's no reason not to, because again, you're dealing with an image and you can always have a copy of it. So the key thing to remember is that image, once you boot from it, it's just like you booted from the original media. That image is now going to change, right? You're booting it in a read-write mode. You can't boot from a disk that's in read-only mode, so you have to enable read-write on that image and boot it up as a virtual machine. There's going to be files written, files overwritten, files changed every time as soon as you boot that disk. So you want to have a copy of the image, an original copy of the image, before you go using a different copy to monkey with in that way. So you always have the original and preserve your best original evidence. When we get evidence, like I said, mostly it's images being uploaded to us. It goes into our lab and it gets written to a disk in the lab that is, it can be written to, but you can't modify any files. And everything gets checked into evidence. As soon as it gets written there, the hash gets created and it's logged into evidence, and it's in read-only mode. That file is now in a non-overwritable state. So you can make a copy of it and put it on a disk where you can do read write and boot from it, but we would keep the copy of that evidence. So really, if there's any kind of theme from this whole week, it's preserve the best original evidence and don't do anything that's going to alter that. Because if you do have any kind of legal matter, I mean, that's what forensics means, right? It's always all about legal matters in the end. If you do have any legal matter that arises, you're going to want that original evidence available. Have a good week.